The harvest is ripe, but the laborers are few. Why did he use that word?
God goes to extreme measures to bring the lost to himself.
The greatest gift you will ever give this world is your intimacy with God.
The Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are all three inside of me. I've got the power right now.
I think what Jesus really wants is people to go. I want to be the answer to Jesus' prayer request.
Welcome to the Fuel for the Harvest podcast.
When this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world, then shall the end come.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of Fuel for the Harvest. This is Nathan.
And this is Charlie. We're your hosts for today. And we're just going to share some real life stuff and the questions that it brings up on this episode. So some of you may have seen on social media posts or heard the situation that my family's been going through the last week or two. Our son was born, and that's awesome. Praise God. We're so excited for that. But within the first 10 hours, we came to discover that he had something called TEF, which means his esophagus was not fully formed and connected to his stomach. And so anytime he would go to eat, it would just stop, like in his esophagus. So, and we didn't know at first, the nurses didn't know at first. Basically he'd be gurgling, breathing, and we're like, something's wrong. And that's what we found out was wrong. So what that meant was we had to be transferred to another hospital. He had to have a surgery done to connect his esophagus properly. And it's a long journey of recovery in a NICU unit before he can leave. As we're recording this podcast, in fact, he is still there right now. And this journey's had all sorts of ups and downs and difficulties and unknowns for our family, financially, everything. Is he going to make it? If he does make it, how long is this journey going to be? What's the difficulty? How many years? What does it look like? And so not the most fun situation, but I'll say that God has been very present in the midst of it and encouraging us along the way. Later on this episode, I'd love to share some of those things that he's put on our mind and heart in this journey. But what we faced, it brought this question into my mind this last week. I've noticed that there are some people, when they face difficulty or suffering in their life or in their family, these types of situations or tragic death or tragedy strikes, whatever it might be, and they leave the faith. They might blame God. God, I can't believe you did this. I can't believe you let this. I can't believe you caused it, whatever it might be. Or they just say, I'm done with you. Like, I'm leaving the faith. And it just got me wondering, like, why is it that happens? What factors play into that? And wanted to just throw that out there and think about that on this episode.
Yeah, I think it's a really super fascinating question, just in light of the fact that there are, like, it's definitely a stereotype at the very least.
Yeah.
We were thinking ahead of the episode about if we know anybody personally who has left the faith because of difficulty, and the closest I could get was I know people who have left the faith because their parents didn't treat them very well, and they have maybe a misunderstanding of who God is because of how their parents treat them, but not necessarily because someone got sick or somebody suddenly died in an unjust way, or the kind of the stereotypical options. But you've probably
seen,
heard,
like, public figures who have, right?
Right. I think that just because we don't necessarily know anybody in particular doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It does.
I've seen it. I've heard it.
Yeah.
So the question is why?
Right. And I think that that list is probably a very long list. But I think if you were to summarize that list, you would come down to some kind of summary that would include people who don't really understand what God is up to in this world. Would you agree? Like, is that the phrase that you would use, or is there a different phrase you would use?
No, I think that could be a reason.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, what I mean is, like, they're pointing the finger at God,
right?
When God's not necessarily the one you should be pointing the finger at, I guess. The one
Yeah.
taking the blame.
I guess that actually brings up another question: is what are the different responses when tragedy strikes?
Sure.
One of them is to blame God.
Yeah. So something bad happens, you blame God. What are the others?
I think another one would be blaming Satan.
Yeah. Yeah.
God didn't do this. Satan, how dare you?
Sure.
Another one could be,
I know that I would blame just the sinful nature typically. Don't get me wrong. I believe in spiritual attack and everything, but I also believe that we just live in a terrible world where sin is just pervasive everywhere in every facet of life.
so that would be another response is we're in a fallen world, so
Yep.
stuff happens.
Yep.
I think another response, which maybe individualize, is like an individual track off of that response, would be to blame yourself
Sure. Yeah.
or your family.
Yeah.
Almost like a karma response.
Mm.
Like, we must have done something bad for this to happen to us.
Yeah. I think that's really common. Like, I've talked to increasingly more people. Actually, I was talking to my neighbor one day, and he said, I think my dad died young because he deserved it.
Wow.
Yeah, long story short, like, it was a much longer conversation than 5 sentences, but like, his understanding of why his dad died in his mid-40s was because he earned an early
It's
death.
interesting.
Yeah.
I see, when I think of all these responses, I think all of them have hints of truth,
Sure.
or could, depending on the circumstance. It's hard to answer, which I guess we'll get to that. But can you think of any other responses? Well, here's one. I think it's just saying, I don't know, but God, I trust you with it.
Okay, yeah. That is definitely a real response that people have. I think it takes a lot of...
I think it's the better response.
It takes a lot of faith, but...
I think it's the best response.
Yeah.
Unless, I don't know. This, for you listening, this episode is just like off the cuff, real life, what's going on.
Yeah.
What do you think, Nate? Any other response you could think of?
No, honestly, I can't think of anything else.
So those are the various responses we could come up with when tragedy strikes. I think one of the ones of trusting God would be another offshoot of that is rejoicing.
Sure.
Like James talks about. Consider it pure joy,
Right.
my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds.
And we've talked about that before on the podcast.
Yeah.
There's maybe
episodes devoted to that verse,
right.
that topic.
There's a couple of episodes out there, I think.
So that happens. Then I think some of those responses could lead people down a trail of leaving the faith.
Yeah.
One of simply blaming God,
Yeah.
just period, would be, well, God did this, so he's not as good as I thought he was.
Sure.
And what I assumed him to be, he doesn't seem to be. He's not helping me in the way that I think I need help. So I want nothing more to do with him.
Would you say that that's a biblically accurate view of how God acts in this world?
What
you just described. So this idea that God didn't give me what I needed or didn't give me what I wanted the way I wanted it, and therefore he's not who I thought he was, and therefore I'm leaving. Right? That's what you just said.
Right. I think people take that view.
Right.
From time to time.
Where the question that I'm trying to ask is, where does that skew from biblical truth? Like, at what point is that not true?
I don't think God always gives us what we want.
Yeah. I also think that a place it skews is you have this idea that God should do or should be a certain way.
Yeah.
And here's the thing about God. He defines himself. He is who he is. And there's nothing we can think or say that would change his nature. And so if God acts in a way that's different than what you expect, then you're thinking, this is not the God who I love or I worship, then you're probably worshiping something
that's not fully his
God,
character.
right?
Yeah. I think the other route why people might leave is, now at first glance this seems okay, but blaming Satan fully.
Sure.
And then
Why would people leave when they blame Satan?
Because then all of a sudden God didn't intervene and stop Satan.
Gotcha.
So again, back to that core.
Yeah.
He's not who I thought he was. He's not powerful enough.
He's not more powerful, seemingly more powerful than.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you might have said, well, God didn't do this, Satan did. But he didn't help.
Mm.
So I don't know if I like it anymore.
Sure.
I think like this Christian walk so much.
I imagine that it would be less common for somebody
I think it's
to leave.
less.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think that could play into it.
Sure, yeah.
So I think there's a variety, a host of reasons why people would walk away, and I can empathize with the feelings that they would have. Like, this is tough. This really sucks. I don't like anything about the situation I'm in. And if it was up to me, it'd look a lot different.
Yeah.
I know people feel that. But what do we do when those things hit? I've been encouraged the last week or so as God has brought various scriptures to mind. And just to right off the bat respond to this question at hand, I would say that it's a wrong view of who God is and biblical truth and the kingdom and how it works, to take up some of these standpoints and run with them to the extreme. Although I think all of them have hints of truth. Mm-hmm. Can Satan attack us?
Yeah.
And impact us? Yes. Does God sometimes cause what we would consider tragedy or allow it? Both. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Biblically speaking, both.
He's caused it and he's allowed it.
Right.
From time to time.
Yeah.
I'm not the one who gets to choose when he does and doesn't.
Right.
And in that he has a greater purpose, I believe. Also, is it because we're in a fallen world? Yes. Is it because of my sin? Maybe sometimes, but not always. We know that our sin has consequences on the people around us. And 1 Corinthians speaks into that. It says if you take communion, essentially, in other words, the Lord's Supper, with the wrong attitude, that's why some of you are sick and dying early.
Right.
Oh, so it could impact.
Yep.
It's possible.
Yep.
So all of that to say, in our particular situation, there's three main verses that have randomly come to my mind, quote unquote randomly, over the last week and a half. I believe God bringing them to mind. The first one, when this first hit us, and it was a surprise to us. We didn't know this ahead of time. And so we're just like sitting there with our son, like, something's wrong. This is not our first kid. Obviously, this is not normal. And the medical people didn't know at first either. And it took some pushing and figuring out in those early hours. When we found out, this verse came to mind when people are asking Jesus, why was this man born blind? In John chapter 9, verse 3. And he says, he was born blind so that the works of God might be displayed in his life. So God brought that to mind, great encouragement, and a prayer that we've picked up, like, Lord, would you reveal your works through our son's life? As time went on over the last week and a half or so, a couple other verses have come to mind. When things weren't going that well with testing and progress, I was praying, and God brought to mind, my ways are higher than your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts, out of Isaiah. That's very clear. Obviously they're not. And then most recently, Habakkuk chapter 1 came to mind. In chapter 1, verse 5, as Habakkuk is looking at the suffering of his people, the Jews, and he's like, come on, God, like, what's going on here? Don't you care about these people? Essentially, in not so many words, that's what he says. And God's response is, I am doing something so great, even if I were to tell you, you wouldn't believe it. It's beyond the circumstances that you can see right in front of your face. And he was. And he was working in a way that they wouldn't have expected. And I think that's very true. I don't know what that big picture is yet in our circumstance. That's also an encouragement God brought my wife as she was praying. There's a bigger picture that God's doing something. What that is, we don't know yet. We have to trust, which is faith. In fact, the other day I was listening to an audiobook called Letters to the American Church by Eric Metaxas. And about halfway through the book, I was listening to it while mowing our property. these words, he's discussing what is true faith, what is true belief. It's not just mental acknowledgement, mental assent, which is what we've fallen into too often in evangelicalism or in Protestant Christianity, starting with Luther. It's faith alone.
Sure.
He even talked about in his book how because it was so revolutionary and transforming for Luther, he almost solely focused on that theological point above and beyond anything else.
Which is as bad as...
Which was good for him,
Right.
but the long-term implications of that are beyond what he would have thought.
Sure.
So even when he translated Romans, it says, by faith you are justified. Luther translated it, by faith alone you are justified. He added that word into the text to emphasize the truth for his generation that they were missing. True, like what he said is true, and it's good. But so do the demons believe,
Sure.
says James. And so you have, like, faith works. It acts out, is essentially what Metaxas is talking about. It's a full trust in God, not just a mental acknowledgement.
Right.
And so he's talking about what true faith is. And then in the middle of this statement, he said these words, which really struck me with our situation. He's like, we acknowledge biblical doctrinal statements, and we acknowledge these truths. And he's going, I don't know if God cares. He does care about that, but he's going to see by the way you're living.
Right.
If you actually believe that.
Right.
And so he's like, we say we trust God, and we say we believe him, but God's asking, like, will you trust him with your life? Will you trust him with your finances? Will you trust him with your spouse's life? Will you trust him with your kid's life? That's what Metaxas literally said in the middle of the book. And I'm like, well, okay, that's like exactly my situation. That's true faith. And at church on Sunday, we were singing the song, You Are Worthy of It All. And these thoughts came to mind while I was prayerfully singing that song of feeling like God was saying this. And it was, if our situation leads to my name being known more, God's name, his name being known more, am I worthy of that to you? Even that, is that enough? No matter the outcome, no matter what happens, if it leads to his name being known more, is he worthy of that? And I think that's a pattern that you see throughout the Bible again and again and again.
Yeah.
His name being known in all the earth, among all the nations. I began to wonder with that, how many babies have had so many people praying for them and acknowledging, like, I know there are people who don't even fully know Jesus who are, like, reading the reports, saying they're praying, hoping God will work, like all this stuff. And there are people who, individuals, thousands upon thousands, entire Bible studies, entire churches, entire Christian schools, people across the globe in different nations have all said they're praying for our son. And I'm like, man, how many babies have had that many people praying for them? Probably a short list, which is really fascinating. I don't know what God has for his life. I don't know what is coming in the days ahead. We have to trust God with that. But according to scriptural truth and what God has been prompting us, we think there's a bigger picture going on. And that's helped us to keep going forward day by day with the ups and the downs. And I just wonder how many people are missing, with biblical illiteracy at an all-time high, are missing the bigger picture. God is at work. It may not look like you want it to look. Is he a God who heals? And is he a God who intervenes? Absolutely. I've seen miraculous healing. I believe he does it today. But I also don't know the timing and what he wants it to look like and what he wants to teach us. And, like, I've been in circumstances in the missions field and here where if I had my way and God intervened earlier, it would have impacted what was to come.
Right.
Like there's a story we shared early on this podcast, episodes and episodes ago, where there's a young guy we got to share the gospel with among the Hod's Bay tribe. And if we had been delayed and made a detour, which I really wanted to do, we would have missed his life.
Yep.
God's timing is not always our timing. And so there are factors we can't see. He is always good in the midst of it. He's always present and God with us. That's a promise that's guaranteed. The rest of it is, hey, I'm doing something that you wouldn't even believe if I told you, as Habakkuk said about his situation with the Jews.
It reminds me of Romans 8:28.
Yeah.
God works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And I know that I've never faced anything to the depth of what you're facing in the last couple weeks here. But I know that as I've faced various things, that's what always comes to mind. And your words about it being a bigger picture are really resonating with me in light of that verse.
Yeah.
Because like that's the deeper truth behind that verse. I, God, am up to a much bigger picture than you could possibly imagine. I'm working this together for good. You think this is outside of my purview? You
No.
think this is in my peripheral vision? No. Like, he knows. He's at work. He's moving, and he's sovereign in the midst of it.
And there have been people who've gone through far worse
Oh, of course.
than us.
Yeah.
And yet still
Yeah.
hold on to hope of God and his kingdom and what he's up to and the bigger picture. And so I would say what we've learned, and I would encourage anybody else, when you face difficulty, tragedy, suffering, look to God, trust in him, knowing that he is working together all things to the good of those who are called to him. Could your flesh be involved? Yes. Could the sinfulness of the world be involved? Yes. Could Satan be involved in attacking? Yes. All of the above. Maybe it's one, maybe it's the other, maybe it's all of them, maybe it's none. I don't know. All are possible, we see in the scriptures at different points. Yet still God can bring good out of all of it, and is working in that way. We see that even in the book of Job. We have a worship song about God that he gives and he takes away. And that actually comes from the book of Job. In our day and age, in our generation, in our society, I think we like to talk about the God who gives. He gives, he gives, he gives. To me, to me, to me. Go ahead. You can write that worship song. It's not trademarked, not copyrighted, because I'm not writing it. And but we forget that sometimes he wants to prune and refine by fire, and that's also equally part of his character. And we can't forget that his ways are higher than our ways. And for whatever reason, he allowed that to happen to Job. And that's the juxtaposition of the book of Job, is God takes away, but also Satan is the one ransacking Job's life.
Yeah.
So we see both of those realities at work, even there, yet Job trusts the bigger picture of what God's doing.
Right.
So I would say the answer I have at this point of life is trust God and his bigger picture of what's going on, and listen for his voice and scripture in the midst of it.
It's pretty profound. I don't want to steal from that by
There's
adding
nothing
more
to-
words.
Nothing to steal from. It's simple truth.
Yeah. Let's I think that we should call the podcast right there. What do you think?
Whatever you think.
All right. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining this latest episode of Fuel for the Harvest. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day. God bless.